Wounded polar bear collapses. In the snow, brave man steps in to help. In the vast, snowy wilderness near Churchill, Manitoba, often called the polar bear capital of the world, an extraordinary tale is about to unfold. A wounded polar bear, majestic yet vulnerable, struggles across the icy terrain, leaving a trail of crimson footprints in the snow. Far off in the distance, a solitary man trudges forward, drawn by the bear's desperate roar. Neither knows it yet, but their paths will cross in a way that defies all expectations. This moment of crisis, fraught with danger and promise, will test their limits of courage, empathy, and hope. And in this frozen realm, a single act of kindness could change everything. Miles of pristine snow stretched under an endless sky, and the wind whistled across the tundra like an ancient melody. Churchill, nestled on the shores of Hudson Bay, had long been a gateway to the Arctic wilderness. Renowned for its wildlife, especially the polar bears that wandered the ice in search of seals, it was a place where man and nature learned to coexist in delicate balance. The days were short, the nights long and shimmering with the dance of the aurora borealis. Despite the punishing cold, there was a raw beauty here that captivated anyone who dared to visit. Most visitors came to Churchill with guided tours and heated vehicles, hoping to catch a glimpse of the bears from the safety of a tundra buggy. But Ethan Walters was not an ordinary tourist. A freelance wildlife photographer and conservation enthusiast, he had traveled alone, choosing to explore the fringes of the frozen expanse on foot. One morning, he set out before dawn, camera in hand, seeking to capture the pale light of sunrise over the Arctic. Little did he know that his quest for a perfect shot would lead him into a life-altering encounter. The air was still, so still that Ethan could hear the crunch of his boots with every step. His breath formed small clouds that drifted upward, merging into the vast open sky. That's when it happened. A faint roar broke through the hush. It was distant, almost indiscernible, but it made him freeze in place. He turned slowly, scanning the horizon. His heart pounded, a mixture of excitement and fear. Polar bears typically roamed alone, and a roar like that could signal distress or aggression. Curiosity and a sense of duty overcame caution. Ethan followed the sound, trudging across the frozen terrain. Each step brought him closer to the unknown, intensifying the quiet tension of the Arctic morning. Through his high-powered binoculars, he saw a flash of white against the snow-white, but tinged with alarming streaks of red. His stomach clenched. Something was terribly wrong. As Ethan inched closer, each footstep felt like a trespass into a sacred realm. The polar bear struggled on the ice, its massive frame quivering under the strain of movement. A crimson trail stained the pristine snow behind it. Even at a distance, Ethan could see that the bear's left shoulder was darkened with blood. The animal's usual regal stance was replaced by a labored, uneven gait. Ethan's instincts as both photographer and conservationist kicked in. He raised his camera, not out of exploitation, but to document the bear's condition, evidence that might later help wildlife authorities. His lens captured close-ups of the bear's anguished eyes, the painful wound, and each labored step. With every click of the shutter, his heart ached. This was not just another dramatic shot for a nature magazine. It was a cry for help, captured frame by frame. He carefully made his way down a gentle slope, mindful of the slick ice. The wind carried the iron tang of blood, mixed with a faint, musky scent of the bear. Despite the danger, he felt compelled to intervene. However, polar bears were apex predators, known for their power and unpredictability. Wounded, it might be even more prone to aggression. Ethan had to approach cautiously if he wanted to do more good than harm. At about 100 yards away, he paused to reassess. The bear was panting, sides heaving, and its dark eyes flickered with pain and exhaustion. For a moment, Bear and man locked gazes. Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears. Could it sense he wasn't a threat? Or was it merely too weak to move? He knew he needed help. Quickly, Ethan pulled out his satellite phone, essential gear in such remote areas. He dialed the local wildlife rescue center in Churchill. The line buzzed before a dispatcher picked up. Stumbling over his words, Ethan described the bear's location and condition. They promised to send a rescue team as soon as possible, but stressed caution. It might be hours before they could arrive. Hours. By then, would the bear still be alive? Ethan ended the call and stared at the wounded creature, feeling torn between his fear of a powerful predator and his compassion for an animal on the brink. The Arctic wind grew fiercer, as though nature itself was testing his resolve. After alerting the authorities, Ethan weighed his options. He could wait at a safe distance for help to arrive, a sensible, risk-free choice. But the bear was bleeding profusely, and there was no telling how badly it was injured internally. If its condition worsened, every second might count. He surveyed the terrain for any sign of shelter or vantage point. Nearby stood a low ridge of ice boulders, shaped and polished by relentless winds. Ethan decided that if he approached carefully, using the ridge as partial cover, he might get closer without startling the bear. His mind raced. Was there a way to stop the bleeding, or at least keep the bear calm until the rescue team arrived? Adrenaline surged through his veins as he advanced. His camera bag felt heavier than ever, and each step required a deliberate effort to avoid slipping. He was aware that a single misstep could trigger the bear's defensive instincts. Yet, something about the animal's posture suggested it was more in shock than ready to lunge. Its strength was waning. Ethan crouched behind one of the ice boulders, peeking around to observe the bear. He noticed a gash running across its shoulder, likely from an encounter with something sharp, a piece of metal debris, or maybe even the jagged edge of broken sea ice. The wound bled steadily, staining the snow. It wasn't a superficial scratch. It cut deep into the bear's muscle tissue. His heart twisted at the sight. He remembered reading a conservation study by Polar Bears International about how increasingly thin ice conditions were causing polar bears to roam unusual territories, exposing them to more dangers. Could climate change or human interference be responsible for the bear's predicament? A faint groan broke his train of thought. The bear tried to lift its head, only to let it fall back onto the snow. Ethan realized with a lurch that the animal might not hold out much longer. He couldn't just stand by and watch it die. Summoning his courage and hoping he wouldn't regret his decision, he stepped out from behind the boulder. Ethan's eyes scanned the horizon before he moved any closer. No other bears in sight. He breathed a small sigh of relief. Approaching a wounded polar bear was reckless enough. Encountering a second bear would be disastrous. Knowing the rescue team was still hours away, he resolved to do what he could. Taking off his camera bag, he rummaged for anything useful. A roll of gauze he always packed for emergencies, a small first aid kit, and a collapsible water container. Though these supplies were meant for human injuries, they could still help. He advanced slowly, arms raised slightly to show he carried no weapon. His voice trembled as he spoke softly to the bear, as though addressing a frightened child. "Easy there, big guy. I'm not here to hurt you. I just want to help." The bear lifted its gaze. Its eyes held a primal fear, but not the aggression Ethan had dreaded. At about 10 yards away, he knelt, setting the gauze and first aid kit on the snow. He had no illusions about cleaning or stitching the wound. That was a task for professional wildlife veterinarians. But perhaps he could slow the bleeding. Carefully, he tore off strips of gauze and bandages. The closer he got, the more the bear's warm, musky scent filled his nostrils. The wound looked worse up close, gaping and oozing. Every muscle in Ethan's body tensed. The bear could easily swat him away with a single paw if it felt threatened. He recalled stories of seasoned researchers being mauled by polar bears in a matter of seconds. Yet, something about this encounter felt different. The bear's eyes were glassy, more pained than hostile. With trembling hands, he extended a strip of gauze toward the wound, alert for any flinch or growl. The bear lay there, letting out a low rumble that vibrated through the frozen air. But it didn't strike. Ethan gently pressed the bandage against the torn flesh, feeling the sticky warmth of blood seep through the fabric. He murmured soothing words, his breath catching in his throat. In that moment, man and bear became unlikely allies, united by a shared need for survival and compassion. Time blurred in the harsh Arctic twilight. Dusk descended quickly at this latitude, painting the sky with ribbons of orange and purple before plunging the tundra into near darkness. Ethan's attempts to stanch the bleeding were rudimentary at best. He managed to layer strips of gauze over the wound and secure them with medical tape, but he knew it was only a temporary measure. The bear still breathed heavily, its eyes flickering between fatigue and a flicker of something else, trust perhaps. With the bleeding somewhat controlled, Ethan realized the bear would need warmth and shelter from the biting cold. Even a creature adapted to the Arctic could succumb to infection or blood loss. The rescue team was still en route. They had called him back with an update. An unexpected storm front was moving in, and visibility for helicopters was plummeting. They might have to attempt a ground rescue on specialized vehicles instead, which would take even longer. Ethan's heart sank. He glanced at the sky. It was growing darker by the minute, the stars barely piercing through thickening clouds. The temperature plummeted with the sun's departure. A brisk, punishing wind began to blow, carrying the scent of ice and impending snow. Ethan knew he had to find some form of shelter for himself and the bear, or risk freezing out here. Not far from where the bear collapsed, he noticed a rocky outcrop that might offer partial protection from the wind. Bracing himself against the cold, Ethan gathered his gear and coaxed the bear to move. The creature stirred, lifting itself onto 3 legs. Its massive head hung low, but it followed Ethan's presence as if understanding his intention. Step by agonizing step, they made their way to the outcrop. There, beneath an overhang of jagged stone, they found a small reprieve from the wind. It wasn't much, but at least it blocked some of the icy gusts. Ethan removed his insulated tarp from his backpack. He laid it on the ground, hoping the bear might rest on it, but the animal merely sank to the snow in exhaustion. A strange partnership formed in the darkness, 2 living beings sharing a space against the Arctic night, bound by the silent acknowledgement that survival could only be achieved together. Huddled in the partial shelter, Ethan recalled the conservation documentaries he had watched as a teenager. The narrator's voice echoed in his mind. Polar bears, fierce and majestic, roam the Arctic ice, relying on instinct and resilience to survive. He remembered how enthralled he had been by their power, their regal demeanor, and the stunning landscapes they inhabited. Now, to be sharing an outcrop with an injured polar bear felt surreal, like stepping inside one of those documentaries. Except this time, the stakes were immeasurably higher. He checked the crude bandages again, worried about the cold's impact on the wound. The makeshift covering was already stained dark red, but it seemed to be slowing the bleed. He had limited supplies, and the storm clouds overhead promised a perilous night. Adrenaline still pumped through his veins, yet he felt an odd calm settling in, the kind that arises when one has no choice but to confront a dire situation head-on. The bear let out a rumbling groan, its eyelids drooping. Ethan recognized signs of shock and extreme fatigue. He unzipped his insulated jacket, partly draping it over the bear's shoulder where the bloody bandages lay. It was a futile gesture, perhaps, but a gesture of empathy nonetheless. For a moment, he pictured his childhood dog, a golden retriever named Rusty, who used to snuggle next to him whenever he was scared. The memory flooded him with warmth and a trace of sadness. Was he anthropomorphizing this wild creature too much, or did they truly share a bond in this moment? Ethan thought of his mother, who had always supported his passion for wildlife photography. She once told him, "Wherever you go, show kindness. Even a small act can mean the difference between life and death." That advice resonated now more than ever. Carefully, he placed a gloved hand on the bear's head, feeling the coarse fur beneath the palm. The animal didn't flinch. In that instant, Ethan felt a profound connection beyond species, beyond fear. A quiet understanding that each life, no matter how large or small, is precious. Outside their tenuous shelter, the wind howled like a restless spirit. The storm arrived in full force, pelting the rocky overhang with snow and ice. The fragile sense of calm Ethan had cultivated began to erode. Visibility dropped to near zero, and he could barely see beyond a few feet. The rescue team's progress would be even slower now, if they could even navigate through this blizzard at all. He tried to keep his satellite phone warm in an inside pocket to preserve its battery life, aware that the Arctic cold could drain it quickly. Checking it again, he saw no new messages, no news from the rescue team. It was just him, the bear, and the raging elements. He decided to set up a small signal device, a handheld beacon that emitted a strobe light. In case the rescuers got close, positioning it outside the overhang, he anchored it in the snow. The tiny pulsing light felt like a frail plea in a vast and indifferent night. Nighttime in the Arctic carried a special kind of darkness, oppressive yet mystical. From their small shelter, Ethan could see swirling snow illuminated briefly by lightning-like flashes of the aurora, dancing overhead greens and purples, swirling in a cosmic ballet. It was both breathtaking and terrifying, a reminder of nature's majesty and its indifference. As the hours passed, Ethan did what he could to keep the polar bear as comfortable as possible. He offered it a few sips of water from his collapsible container, though he wasn't sure if the bear would drink. The creature lapped at the water weakly, then laid its head back on the snow. Watching it struggle made Ethan's own chest tighten. He wondered if the bear felt fear. Did it comprehend what was happening? Time became elastic. The wind roared endlessly, stripping away any warmth that tried to settle in the alcove. Ethan felt the biting chill seep through his layers of clothing. Occasionally, he would talk quietly to the bear, not expecting a response, but hoping the soothing cadence of his voice could provide some comfort. And beneath every word, every gesture, was the question that kept haunting him: would help arrive in time? After what felt like an eternity, the storm showed the faintest sign of weakening. The wind's shriek subsided to a steady whistle. Snow still fell in relentless sheets, but the world beyond their rocky alcove no longer seemed like a swirling chaos of white and darkness. Ethan ventured outside briefly to shake off the accumulating snow and check on the strobe beacon. The sky had lightened to a dull grey, hinting that dawn might be near. Returning to the bear, he found it in a shallow sleep, each breath punctuated by a soft growl. Ethan noticed the bandages were soaked through. Carefully, he replaced them with the last of his clean gauze, though he was running critically low on supplies. He gently patted the bear's head, the thick fur damp from melted snow. The animal blinked at him, and for a moment their eyes locked, forging a sense of companionship he'd never imagined possible. His muscles ached from hours of crouching, and his fingers stung with cold despite insulated gloves. He checked his phone again, still no signal from the rescue team. A knot of dread coiled in his stomach at the thought of the hours, or even days, they might still have to wait. Could the bear last that long in its weakened condition? Could he? To stave off despair, Ethan tried to focus on the small victories. The bear was still alive, still breathing. He himself hadn't succumbed to hypothermia. Even if they were both exhausted, they had made it through the storm's worst fury. He remembered a quote from a favorite nature writer, Farley Mowat: "We are not so different, the beasts and us. We fight, we suffer, we love, and we endure." Here and now, that resonated with unwavering clarity. The distance between a human being and a polar bear seemed suddenly smaller, a gap bridged by a shared will to live and an unspoken acceptance that they were in this together. If nature had turned harsh and uncaring on this night, it also provided them with this rare moment of mutual reliance and understanding. As dawn broke, a weak, pale sunlight filtered through the cloud cover. Everything in sight was coated in a fresh blanket of snow, lending a deceptive tranquility to the Arctic wilderness. The strobe beacon still blinked dutifully, although it was partially buried. Ethan cleared the snow around it, then paused to take stock of his surroundings. The wind had scattered small drifts, revealing tracks from the polar bear's painful journey. It struck him how vulnerable even the mightiest creature could become when confronted with injury and an unforgiving environment. He thought about vulnerability in his own life, times he'd struggled to make ends meet as a freelance photographer, or the lingering grief from losing his father in a boating accident years ago. Those experiences felt distant, yet oddly parallel to what he was witnessing, a fierce being brought low by circumstances beyond its control. A wave of empathy washed over him. In many ways, they were both just souls trying to survive in a perilous world. With the storm's fury abated, Ethan ventured farther from the alcove to scout for the rescue team's possible route. The glare from the fresh snow stung his eyes, making him squint even behind protective goggles. In the distance, the icy expanse stretched unbroken, a panorama of white and silver. There was no sign of vehicles or helicopters. Even the wind seemed to have lost its roar, as though exhausted by the night's tempest. Frustration and worry gnawed at him. How long could the bear hold on without proper medical care? Could the rescue team even find them in such a vast expanse? He contemplated whether he should attempt to move the bear towards civilization, but that was unrealistic. Polar bears could weigh anywhere from 700 to 1,500 pounds. Even if the bear were uninjured, guiding it across the ice would be an impossible task. Injured, it was out of the question. Defeated for the moment, he trudged back to their makeshift shelter. The bear perked up slightly at his return, a slow blink of acknowledgement. Ethan felt his spirit lift just a fraction. They might be isolated in this frozen wilderness, but neither of them was truly alone anymore. The morning pressed on, and Ethan busied himself with small tasks to stay warm and keep his anxiety at bay. He used what was left of his first aid kit to clean around the bear's wound, applying a mild antiseptic from a half-used tube. The bear flinched at the sting, issuing a low rumble, but it didn't retaliate. Ethan wondered at its tolerance. Was it trust or merely exhaustion? His stomach growled, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since the previous morning. From his backpack, he retrieved an energy bar and forced himself to take measured bites. Survival in these conditions meant rationing resources carefully. He also melted some snow in a small camping pot over a portable heating element, something he'd brought to prepare freeze-dried meals. This would give them additional water, which he again offered to the bear. It lapped at it slowly, its muzzle coated in water crystals that sparkled in the fragile sunlight. Just as Ethan considered calling the rescue center again, his phone buzzed faintly in his pocket. Relief surged through him like a lightning bolt. He fumbled to answer, his voice cracking as he said, "Hello?" A crackling voice on the other end identified itself as Brandon, the lead coordinator from the Churchill Wildlife Rescue Team. They had finally navigated partway across the frozen terrain, but were facing mechanical issues with one of their tundra buggies. They needed an approximate coordinate update. Ethan relayed his GPS coordinates as clearly as he could, his words tumbling out in an urgent rush. Brandon told him they'd arrive in 2 or 3 hours if the repairs went smoothly. They had a wildlife veterinarian with them, plus sedation equipment specially designed for large bears. Their plan was to tranquilize the bear gently, treat it, and transport it to a temporary rehabilitation facility in Churchill. The polar bear would have a fighting chance. Ending the call, Ethan felt a jolt of cautious optimism. For the first time since discovering the bear, there was a tangible possibility of rescue. He patted the bear's head, whispering, "Hold on, buddy, help is on the way." In that moment, hope shimmered in the cold Arctic air, a ray of light cutting through the gloom of uncertainty. The next couple of hours were some of the longest of Ethan's life. Time dragged as he tended to the wounded bear, checking the bandages, offering water, and talking in a calm, reassuring tone that he wasn't even sure the bear understood. Outside their shelter, the day brightened enough for him to see small details, drifts of snow shaped by the wind, tiny ice crystals that shimmered like diamonds, and the tracks he'd made in his restless pacing. Despite the pressing urgency, nature carried on with indifference. A lone Arctic fox skittered at the edge of Ethan's vision, sniffing at the air but keeping its distance. The sun rose higher, its weak rays painting everything in a fleeting gold. The scenery was breathtaking, a reminder of why he'd come to this region in the first place, to capture the raw, unspoiled beauty of a land at the edge of the world. Yet, never had he imagined being so intimately entwined with one of its most powerful inhabitants. Every few minutes, Ethan peered over the ridge, searching for any sign of rescue vehicles. Snow crunched underfoot, the echo of his own footsteps eerily loud in the stillness. Each time, he returned with a slightly heavier heart. The bear, meanwhile, rested on its side, occasionally lifting its head to watch Ethan move about. Their eyes met often. In those moments, Ethan sensed an unspoken bond. Perhaps the bear recognized him as a source of relief, or at least as a non-threat. Eventually, the wind carried a faint, mechanical rumble. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He scrambled up to a vantage point and squinted into the distance. Yes, there. A dark shape crawled across the horizon, metal reflecting sunlight. Relief and excitement exploded in his chest. Waving his arms wildly, he hoped the rescuers would spot him or his strobe beacon. Soon, another shape joined the first, two vehicles inching forward through the snow. He slid back down to the alcove, adrenaline surging. "They're almost here," he said, more to the bear than to himself. The creature responded with a low, guttural sigh, closing its eyes. Holding on to hope, Ethan prepared to guide the team to their location, determined to see this rescue through. Moments later, the hum of engines grew louder, finally cresting over the ridge. Two rugged tundra buggies, built to handle the unforgiving Arctic terrain, came into view. Ethan rushed out into the open, flagging them down. The first vehicle halted about 30 yards away, the second pulling up behind it. A flurry of activity ensued as the doors swung open. Brandon, a tall, bearded man with a kind face, hopped down. Behind him was Dr. Elaine Varma, the wildlife veterinarian, her dark hair swept up in a bun beneath a heavy fur-lined hood. Several other crew members followed, armed with medical kits and specialized equipment. Their breath formed clouds in the icy air as they approached cautiously. "Ethan, right?" Brandon said, extending a gloved hand. Ethan nodded, relief evident in his eyes. "Thank God you found us," he replied, voice trembling, not just from cold, but from the emotional toll of the last 24 hours. Brandon turned to the rest of the team, issuing quick instructions: set up the sedation rifle, prep the medical gear, keep the tundra buggies warm in case they needed to move fast. Dr. Varma asked Ethan to detail the bear's condition, how long it had been bleeding, and what first aid measures he'd taken. She listened intently, nodding as she mentally catalogued the information. Then they carefully approached the bear. The animal stirred, lifting its head to look at the newcomers. Its eyes flicked from Ethan to the group, uncertain. "Doctor." Varma positioned the sedation rifle, aiming for a muscle area in the bear's rump. She fired, the dart whizzing through the air and sinking into the bear's thick fur. The creature growled, alarmed, but within a few minutes, its eyelids drooped and it settled into a sedated state. Swiftly, the team moved in. "Doctor." Varma examined the wound, praising Ethan's makeshift bandaging efforts. She cleaned and disinfected the injury more thoroughly, noting signs of infection beginning to set in. Another crew member started on the fourth drip, designed for large mammals, delivering fluids and medication. Brandon and two others carefully lifted the bear onto a reinforced stretcher, prepping it for transport. Ethan stood by, heart pounding with relief and residual fear. It was an incredible sight, trained professionals coming together to save one of the Arctic's greatest predators. And as the bear's labored breathing eased under sedation, Ethan felt like he was witnessing a miracle. With the bear secured, the crew maneuvered the stretcher onto the rear platform of one of the tundra buggies. It was a delicate operation, requiring multiple hands to ensure the animal's bulk was supported without aggravating the wound. The sedation would only last so long, and no one wanted to be wrestling with a semi-conscious polar bear. Once everything was strapped down, Brandon gave the signal to head out. Before climbing aboard, Ethan took one last look at the makeshift alcove. Memories of the stormy night flooded back the howl of the wind, the flicker of hope in the polar bear's eyes. He felt a pang of nostalgia for a place he never wanted to see again under such dire circumstances. Gathering his gear, he joined the rescue team inside the tundra buggy. The vehicle lurched forward, its massive tires crunching through thick drifts of snow. Dr. Varma and a veterinary assistant hovered over the bear, monitoring its vital signs. On the narrow bench opposite them, Ethan tried to absorb the reality of the moment. They were actually saving a polar bear, bridging the gap between human compassion and wild nature. The hum of the engine melded with the steady beep of medical instruments, creating an odd harmony in the frigid air. Brandon drove carefully, avoiding deep ice pockets that could tip the vehicle. The second tundra buggy followed close behind. Through the frosted windows, Ethan caught glimpses of the Arctic scenery, the endless white plains, and the distant shimmer of Hudson Bay. Despite everything, the view was spectacular. He wondered how many polar bears roamed out there, equally vulnerable but unseen. Conversation was sparse. Everyone focused on their tasks or lost in thought. Dr. Varma provided occasional updates. The bear's temperature was still low, blood pressure stabilized by the fourth fluids. The wound likely needed stitches at the facility. As they crossed a patch of rough ice, the bear groaned in sedation, its immense paw twitching. Ethan reached out, placing a gentle hand on the bear's flank. He had never felt more alive or more responsible for another life. This moment was bigger than just one man helping a wounded animal. It was a testament to resilience, compassion, and the fragile threads that connect all living beings in this world. Several hours later, the tundra buggies rolled into the outskirts of Churchill. A modest building with reinforced walls and large steel doors came into view, part of a specialized wildlife rehabilitation center run in cooperation with Manitoba Conservation. Ethan felt a surge of relief. This was a place where experts could tend to the polar bear's injuries properly, away from the perils of the Arctic wilderness. As they pulled up, staff members rushed out with a larger wheeled stretcher designed for large animals. Under Dr. Varma's guidance, they carefully transferred the bear inside. The facility smelled of antiseptic and animal musk. Clean, warm air enveloped them, a stark contrast to the sub-zero world they'd just left behind. Ethan followed at a respectful distance, not wanting to get in the way, but also feeling an inexplicable need to stay close to the bear. Inside a dedicated exam area, Dr. Varma began the meticulous process of cleaning and stitching the wound. Antibiotics were administered, along with medication to stabilize the bear's heart rate and temperature. Ethan watched in awe. These professionals worked with swift precision, their movements honed by countless similar rescues. Eventually, the sedation wore off enough for the bear to regain semi-consciousness. It stirred, letting out a soft moan as it attempted to rise. Dr. Varma's team gently restrained it, ensuring it wouldn't reopen the wound. Despite the environment being alien to it, bright lights, strange noises, the smell of disinfectant, the bear didn't thrash violently. Its eyes darted around, scanning the room. When they settled on Ethan's figure, standing off to the side, he dared to think it recognized him. Seeing the bear in a safer, controlled space filled Ethan with a profound sense of accomplishment. He recalled the moment he'd first spotted it struggling on the ice, blood staining its fur. Now, that same bear had a chance to heal. The fight was far from over, but survival was more than possible. While the center's staff moved around it in a choreographed dance of care and expertise, Ethan felt a surge of gratitude to them, to the rescue team, and to the bear itself, for trusting him in that frozen moment of crisis. That evening, Ethan settled into a small guest room within the Churchill Arctic Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, his body sinking into the cot with a weariness he could never have imagined. Exhaustion clung to him like the remnants of the winter storm he had endured, weighing on his limbs and making his eyelids heavy. Yet, try as he might, he could not quiet his racing mind. Every second of the past days replayed in his thoughts, the distant roar that had first alerted him, the heart-pounding moments when he found the wounded polar bear bleeding onto the snow, and the surreal hours they spent huddled together beneath the rocky outcrop. He also recalled the triumphant arrival of the rescue team, Brandon's calm authority, and Dr. Elaine Varma's tireless work, which ultimately led them all here to relative safety. The guest room was modest but comforting, pale walls, a single window that looked out onto the stark, snowy landscape, and a small desk strewn with pamphlets about polar bear conservation efforts. The overhead light buzzed softly, its dull glow adding a kind of serenity to the space. Ethan found himself oddly at peace. Despite being physically and emotionally drained, there was a sense that he had come full circle, from stepping alone onto the tundra with only his camera to now being immersed in the very heart of polar bear rescue operations. Earlier in the evening, Dr. Varma had taken a moment to sit with him in the facility's communal lounge, a space warmed by a large electric heater and decorated with photos of polar bears that had been successfully rehabilitated in the past. She explained how the surgery to close the bear's wound had gone. The gash was deep, and internal bruising had been more extensive than they initially realized, but they managed to suture the torn muscles and apply antibiotics directly to the affected tissue. They also administered intravenous fluids to help combat the risk of infection and keep the bear's strength up. The next 48 hours will be critical, Dr. Varma had said, cradling a mug of hot tea between her hands. Her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed the gravity of the situation. We need to watch for fever, signs of organ stress, or reopening of the wound. If those remain under control, the bear should rally. Ethan remembered nodding quietly, his heart thudding in his chest. He felt a surge of protectiveness. He wanted more than anything for this magnificent creature to heal. Long after Dr. Varma excused herself to return to her rounds, he sat there alone, gazing at a photograph on the lounge wall. In it, a healthy polar bear frolicked on a slab of ice, its reflection mirrored in the icy water below. The plaque beneath read, "Release 2017, Thriving in the Wild." He found himself wondering if his bear already he thought of it in possessive terms. though it was a wild being would. One day star in a photo like that, healthy and proud against the Arctic backdrop. Now, in his small room, he closed his eyes, but images of the bear's pained gaze haunted him. The memory felt incredibly vivid. The bear's deep brown eyes, clouded by both fear and exhaustion, had held him captive in a way no photograph ever could. In that silent exchange, Ethan had sensed a plea for help and, strangely enough, a capacity for trust. He couldn't help but feel that moment had shifted something in his own spirit, reminding him of the power of empathy, a reminder that sometimes bridging the gap between man and beast was not only possible, but necessary. His camera bag, slouched in the corner, caught his attention. Inside were memory cards filled with photos from the rescue, the bear's wound, the frantic attempts at makeshift bandaging, the harrowing storm that nearly claimed them both. Perhaps these images would one day serve as a plea for broader conservation efforts. Maybe, just maybe, they could wake people to the reality of polar bears' precarious situation in a warming world. That thought emboldened him, lending an extra spark to his fatigue-numbed mind. If sharing those photos could save even one more bear, it would mean the trials he had faced were not in vain. Eventually, he collapsed back onto the cot, letting the hum of the overhead lights lull him closer to rest. But when sleep finally claimed him, it was anything but peaceful. He was transported into a dreamscape of swirling snowdrifts and iridescent auroras. In one dream, he stood atop the ice under a shimmering sky, side by side with the polar bear as if they were equals, neither wounded nor afraid. Their eyes met in a shared moment of calm, unburdened by the survival struggles of the real world. Ethan awoke from that dream with his heart thumping, unsure whether it had comforted or saddened him. Maybe it was both. Dawn brought a muted glow through the frosted glass of his window. He blinked sleep from his eyes, slipping his feet into insulated slippers and pulling on a sweater. Despite the center's heating system, a chill lingered in the corners of every room, a reminder that they were still in one of the coldest regions on Earth. Splashing cold water on his face in the small adjoining bathroom, Ethan stared at his reflection, noting the dark circles under his eyes and the slight stubble on his chin. He barely recognized himself. Yet beneath the surface exhaustion, he sensed a renewed determination, like he had found a deeper calling. He made his way to the observation area, a short hallway trek from the guest quarters. The corridor walls displayed educational posters about polar bear physiology, diagrams of muscle structures, paw prints, and how their thick fur and blubber kept them insulated against the frigid Arctic winds. At the end of the hallway, a thick glass window allowed visitors and staff to quietly watch the recovering animals without disturbing them. The polar bear, still bandaged and fitted within the fourth line, lay in a specially designed enclosure, sprinkled with shaved ice and light snow, an environment more natural than a typical indoor kennel. Ethan's heart pounded at the sight of it lying there, chest rising and falling in a calm, steady rhythm. Dr. Varma stood nearby with a clipboard, meticulously recording vital signs. She looked up when she sensed movement behind the glass and spotted Ethan. A gentle smile lit her face, and she lifted her hand in a small wave before giving him a thumbs up. He felt an immense weight lift from his shoulders. Stepping inside the enclosure's outer gate, careful to follow the safety protocol, he spoke softly to Dr. Varma. "How is it doing?" "Better," she replied with a nod of satisfaction. "No sign of fever overnight, and the wound is draining nicely without signs of severe infection. We're not out of the woods, but things are looking good." Ethan exhaled slowly, as though he'd been holding his breath for hours. He inched a bit closer to the viewing panel, not wanting to disturb the bear's rest. Even at a distance, he noticed the rise and fall of its thick torso and the gentle twitch of its whiskers. The memory of that desperate night Its heavy, ragged breathing against the swirling snow flashed across his mind, and he shuddered at how close they had both come to tragedy. Now, seeing it safe and under expert care filled him with a sense of awe. For the first time since hearing that fateful roar in the tundra, he felt a genuine sense of optimism, like a beam of sunlight breaking through the storm clouds that had loomed over them for so long. He hadn't rescued the bear alone. It was the collective effort of the rescue team, Dr. Varma's skill, and the resources of the rehabilitation center. But in his heart, he still believed his decision to act, however risky, had been guided by something pure, perhaps an innate drive to protect life in all its forms. "Thank you for everything," Ethan whispered to Dr. Varma, unable to fully express how grateful he was that people like her existed. She simply smiled, understanding that words were not enough to encapsulate what they had all been through. With that, she returned to her medical chart, making notes on medication schedules and further tests. Ethan lingered by the window a few minutes longer, watching the bear's slow, rhythmic breaths. He allowed himself to imagine the day when this noble creature might stand once again on the vast Arctic ice, unencumbered by wounds or bandages, its eyes clear and powerful as it surveyed a realm meant for beings as grand as itself. He turned and headed back toward the lounge, determined to talk to Brandon about how they might use his photographs to raise greater awareness. But deep inside, he also realized something profound about himself. He had changed. The wounded bear in the snow had become more than just a photography subject or a wild animal in distress. It was living proof that compassion could span all boundaries, even those that seemed insurmountable. And as he stepped away from the enclosure, a quiet hope swelled within him, hope that this single, life-changing encounter could spark a broader movement to protect not only this one bear, but an entire species struggling to survive under the harsh realities of a shifting world. The next day, the bear's condition improved noticeably. Its eyes were more alert, and it moved its limbs with growing coordination. Dr. Varma carefully removed the initial bandages, inspecting the stitches beneath. Though the wound was large, it showed the beginnings of healthy scar tissue. Encouraged, she adjusted the bear's medications, slowly reducing the sedation to allow it to become more aware of its surroundings. Ethan watched from behind the glass panel, camera in hand. Dr. Varma had granted him permission to document the bear's recovery, hoping his photographs might help illustrate the crucial work done by the center. He snapped a few shots of the staff cleaning the wound and checking vital signs. Each click felt like a celebration of life overcoming adversity. Occasionally, the bear would shift its head toward the observation window. Ethan wondered if it sensed his presence. He recalled the moment they had shared under that rocky outcrop, how its labored breathing seemed to synchronize with his own. Now, inside this sterile environment, they were separated by glass and professional protocols. But a part of him still felt intimately connected to the bear's fate. By late afternoon, the bear stood on wobbly legs, testing its strength. A special enclosure, outfitted with a floor of packed snow, allowed it to walk without slipping on a slick surface. The staff clapped quietly, celebrating this small victory. Ethan couldn't help but grin, his heart soaring at the sight. Each tentative step represented resilience, a testament to survival against the odds. That evening, Brandon and some members of the rescue team stopped by the facility. They congratulated Ethan, calling him a hero, but he insisted he had only done what anyone would. "I just happened to be there," he said with a modest shrug. Brandon patted him on the shoulder. "That's what heroes usually say." Feeling a little overwhelmed, Ethan retreated to the break room with a cup of hot chocolate. Outside, the setting sun cast a pink hue over Churchill's snowy landscape. He thought about the countless polar bears roaming the ice, each one facing its own struggles in a changing Arctic. His heart ached for them. If saving this one bear could make even a tiny difference, raise awareness, or inspire kindness, then maybe all the risk, the cold, and the fear had been worth it. By the end of the week, the polar bear had made remarkable progress. Its wound had begun to heal, and it was strong enough to stand upright without assistance. Dr. Varma decided to move forward with a plan to reintroduce the bear into the wild. A small radio collar would be fitted to monitor its movements and gather data that could aid conservation efforts. On the day of release, Ethan stood with the rescue team near the outskirts of Churchill, not far from the icy shoreline of Hudson Bay. The air was crisp, the sky a brilliant blue. Large chunks of sea ice drifted in the distance, a reminder that the bear would soon resume the life it was meant to lead, roaming the Arctic in search of seals, defying the cold as it always had. The bear emerged from its transport crate, sniffing the air. It paused, shaking off the sedation's lingering effects. Ethan couldn't breathe for a moment, mesmerized by the animal's regal presence. Even in a recovering state, the bear radiated power and dignity. It turned, gazing at the small group of humans who had safeguarded its life. For a heartbeat, Ethan felt that old connections stir, the memory of shared vulnerability and trust. Then, with a surprisingly graceful stride, the bear lumbered toward the ice. The group watched silently as it ventured farther and farther away, each step taking it closer to its true habitat. Eventually, the bear's ivory form melted into the glistening white of the horizon. It was free again. A lump formed in Ethan's throat. He realized he might never see this bear again, yet it had left an indelible mark on his soul. The experience had taught him about the fragility of life, whether it belonged to a polar bear or a man seeking purpose. It showed him how a single act of kindness could ripple outward, uniting strangers and saving lives. When he finally turned to leave, Ethan felt an overwhelming gratitude for the people, the place, and the bear that had brought him here. The Arctic wind now felt like an old friend, its chill no longer a threat but a reminder of how far he had come. With that, Ethan knew his journey didn't end here. It was just beginning, spurred by the silent roar of a wounded polar bear and the limitless courage found in a single beating heart. Thank you for watching and experiencing this powerful story of compassion, resilience, and personal growth. From the first moment, Ethan heard that faint roar echo across the frozen tundra, to the breathtaking instant the wounded polar bear found freedom. Again, every step of this journey has reminded us that hope can be found even in the most desolate places. It proves that a single act of kindness can bridge the distance between species and shape a better tomorrow for wildlife and for all of us sharing this planet. If you found value in this moving tale, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. By doing so, you help spread awareness about wildlife conservation and inspire others to protect and cherish our fragile natural world. Together, we can keep stories of courage and compassion alive. Thank you for your support.